Okay, so Guy, I'm just going to introduce you. If I can just turn to my notes here. So Guy is founder and MD of Accessible PRS, and Guy is committed to seeing growth of accessible housing, seeing it as an absolute necessity and as well as a huge opportunity in a chronically undersupplied market area. In fact, I think, Guy, from conversations previously, you've mentioned that there's something of the order of a need for 400,000 accessible homes across the UK, something of that order? Oh, sorry, I'm stealing your thunder. I'm so sorry. It's a lot. It's a big number. Okay, spoiler alert. Guy has had over 20 years in property, in a range of different aspects of the property system, and having sustained a spinal injury in 2003, Guy brings lived experience to his role, providing both commercially driven and insightful perspectives to the challenge of accessibility in housing. And it's not just a theoretical exercise for Guy, because he's built his own accessible and sustainable family home and lives by the social model of disability. And I think it's fair to say, Guy, you're teaching us a lot about what that means in practice, so thank you very much. So we need to be continuing to try to work to remove obstacles in the built environment to really live the value that a person is not limited to or defined by their disability. So Guy, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Linda. So yes, that house that you alluded to is a straw bale house, which is wonderful and amazing, but it's not scalable. And so when I was introduced to Craig, it felt like coming home, and I'm very excited about Agile generally. So I set up Accessible PRS to catalyse access and inclusion in the mainstream property sector, because at the moment everything seems separate. We're this little kind of niche, and it's not working. So I have three key objectives. The first is to increase accessible housing at scale in the UK. The second is to make the process of finding accessible housing easy, again through the mainstream portals. I call it the 3 AM test, and I've got stuff going on there. And the third is really what we're doing here. It's reframing the narrative of what accessibility means, and helping mainstream property understand its relevance and its benefits. So I like at the start of a talk just to ask everyone to stand up, please. Audience participation. And I'm going to ask you 4 questions to give you the opportunity to sit back down. So the first question: excluding me, if you know a wheelchair user or parents with a disabled child, please sit down. If you know someone living with a degenerative condition, please sit down. In fact, there's a whole load. It could be arthritis, stroke, multiple sclerosis, dementia, motor neuron disease, muscular dystrophy. Third question: if you know someone aging and needing greater care needs, such as a parent or a grandparent, sit down. And finally, if you know someone who lives with mental health issues, sit down. So take a look around the room. I need you to understand that this is relevant to every single person here. And it's not just the people here, it's everyone you know, and it's the UK at large. Now I want you to imagine that person unable to freely move around their home. Maybe they can't bath their children or put them to bed. Maybe they've soiled themselves because they couldn't get to the bathroom. Maybe they're not working because they can't get up and out independently. Probably they feel useless and a burden because their lack of autonomy means they can't contribute to family and community in ways that we take for granted. So my message here is that this is about the home environment, not their condition. And it can be the difference, it usually is the difference, between well-being and mental ill health. I believe that housing equates to opportunity. This is not original thought. and Linda alluded to it earlier. A quick look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs reminds us that we need shelter and security in order to grow, develop, and live our best lives. I find the potential to be part of creating opportunities for fellow humans exhilarating and motivating. Unfortunately, UK housing is blinkered when it comes to accessible design and implementation. Mostly, we've not learned what housing can be, what it can create, where it can lead us. We talk about communities, we talk about placemaking, we talk about sustainability, but really, our self-limiting beliefs deliver and rationalise rabbit hutches, profit without value, utilitarian function, certainly not wheelchair accessible housing. And this opportunity that I speak of isn't, in my work, just for the 1.2 million wheelchair users in the UK and their families. It's for all of us. Why? Because accessibility is a golden key that unlocks gifts in housing. We think of accessibility and inclusion as difficult, complex, unmanageable, conceptual, and financially unfeasible. That is our block. Not the market, not property companies, not lack of space, not ugly design, but ours. Quick show of hands. How many of you here go into work knowing every day that you are firefighting, that you cannot achieve a set of objectives of finding suitable housing for people in need, or that you don't believe in the product you're creating? Any brave souls who'll put a hand up? A few. Great. And that, I know, is demoralizing. I see the problem with accessible housing caused by how uncomfortable we feel around disability, the subconscious beliefs and reinforced stereotypes lurking and haunting us when we have to house people with disabilities. Nowhere is there normal or equality, just senses of charity, pity, burden. Accessibility in housing has nothing to do with rational or pragmatic obstacles. I believe this for two very good reasons. The first is that in my conversations with various large organisations, I show how the obstacles aren't obstacles. And it goes up and down the hierarchy without resolve until I initiate a more honest and uncomfortable conversation. Then we see the subconscious obstacles. I'm here to create a safe space and to shine a light, not to shame or expose anyone. Which brings me on to my second reason. I've had to go through the process myself. My disability is acquired. I've had to make peace with my own injury. And when reading books on gender equality, Black Lives Matters, and pride, I realised the work I needed to do, and also how significantly disability equality lags behind in the diversity family. I started a social media campaign called #NoPlaceCalledHome. It was storytelling. Each person's story tells of a relatable human, familiar life experiences, just hampered by an impossible housing situation. It's neither triumph over adversity, inspiration porn, nor pitying, which is the current accessible housing narrative. But it has no reach, because people don't engage with it. Of course they don't. They don't know how. It's outside their comfort zone, their experience, and it doesn't feel like a problem they can solve with a click. So we need a shift of focus. For me, problem solving is a joyful and creative process. It's when we look outside of what we know and do and find incredible ideas, experiments and successes achieved by others. Perhaps you'll think, well, that's a nice guy, but we still don't see how to solve accessible housing. Where do our self-limiting beliefs come from that we have to keep on doing what we've been doing, knowing that it doesn't work? Why do we need to wait for permission to act? And who do we think is going to give us that permission? Or we assume that our ideas aren't important, and so we don't speak up at work. You know, we can rewrite this story. Let me tell you how I see this. All the women in this room will have experienced queuing for toilets at the theatre or an event. Time is limited, but the queue takes you away from friends, food or drinks and the action, and you may also be shepherding kids through, but you're queuing, cursing men for our crap designs, stressing about time and the unpleasant environment and trying to hold it in. And this has been going on for decades, centuries. You already have an insight to how we can think about accessible and inclusive design. The women queuing to use the loo don't need pity or help. It's a laughable and odd suggestion. They just need a voice in the design process, and a designer who's thought about the problem in a wider context. I'm going to suggest that one of the obstacles to accessible housing comes from our collective reinforced stereotypes of disability, our unquestioned beliefs of charity for, or pity of, a group needing help. As US disability activist Judy Heumann said, I'm very tired of being thankful for accessible toilets, you know. If I have to feel thankful about an accessible bathroom, when am I ever going to be equal in the community? Well, along come Amber Probyn and Hazel McShane, Bristol University graduates, and rethink this, shall we call it a problem or an opportunity, with Pequel. Suddenly, peeing at events for women is a different and equalised prospect. Who benefits? The women, the event organisers, the stall holders. They've worked out how much extra women could be spending now they're not queuing. And the environment. They've worked out the carbon savings of their designs too. Google it. Now let's think about another project. A small piece of land on a slope with a blank design page. The people who live here are going to live here are vulnerable, marginalised people who already have a lifetime of battling self-loathing and zero self-worth. And these homes are going to be a stepping stone to recovery. The client wants to see results, and we know that some of these residents will be wheelchair users because they have amputations due to previous abuses and self-neglect. Housing units are going in on 2 levels, and there'd be shared recreational space towards the bottom of the plot. There is an exciting suggestion that we could aim for 100% wheelchair housing. The focus is on the accommodation, and a question is raised. What do we think of platform lifts? But let's use this time to think about it differently, as we know we can design accessible accommodation. I mean, we have approved document M, we have access consultants. Let's think about inclusion and those results for the client. As a thought, what if there's a longer wheelchair accessible path from the top to the bottom of the site, which includes planting to nourish some very damaged soils, lighting to feel safe and be seen, opportunities to stop, sit, just breathe, to spontaneously meet and be with others who support and share our experiences. The path will get people where they need to go and would be the preferred choice of routes for someone walking as well as the wheelchair user, which means everyone is included and shares the same experience, no more marginalisation. How do we feel about our client needs now, and what do we think about that platform lift? Sure, we can have a lift, they're useful. But now we're using that difficult wheelchair user to think about the third space, that zone between home to where we're going, to think about the multiple functions that inclusion can deliver and the improved outcomes for everyone involved. We're taking intractable questions about access, turning them on their heads with a wider perspective to deliver outcomes that are far more powerful to clients and their beneficiaries. We don't need explicit permission or brief to do this. We just need to guard our own childlike curiosities about other people around us. We need to shed the taboos of our childhoods that say we mustn't point or ask questions. We have built an accessible housing crisis in the UK. We've done it by refusing to collect data, by not acknowledging the issue, and by prioritising other political interests. The government response from their 2020 accessible housing consultation landed this summer, quietly in the holidays, and amongst serious news and reportage of war, and scarcely mentioned wheelchair accessible living standards. The hyperbole of change and accessibility was directed at the visitable standards, not the living standards. So let's put some of this into context. There are 1.8 million households in England that contain at least one person with a disability. It's a dry statistic, and it masks who and how many other people are affected. For example, I live with my wife and 2 children. That's 4 people with accessible housing needs, not just me. Taken in context, the figures start becoming very relevant and very urgent. There are 1.2 million wheelchair users in the UK, but consider the over 400,000 wheelchair users living in unsuitable accommodation. They might look like the person you thought of at the beginning of this talk, dragging themselves across the floor to get to the bathroom, or living, sleeping, eating, washing, and toileting in their front room with the rest of their family and kids, or young people living in end-of-life care facilities indefinitely, or living with fear of eviction with nowhere but a crappy, inaccessible hostel as temporary housing, despite complex care packages or round-the-clock live-in carers. I live in, Florence Nightingale is buried in the church in our village, so a good excuse to use her quote. So if you have an accessible housing problem, and you do, let's stop seeing it as a problem. It's a massive opportunity. Ask, where can this opportunity take us? What other questions we can start by asking? Whose voices do we actually need to hear? What future resilience and community are we going to build through collaboration, through bringing different lived and professional experiences to solve the same goal? Because housing and communities that include older and disabled people are going to benefit their parents, their children, their friends and colleagues in ways we can't yet imagine. And so are you going to benefit? You're going to go to work motivated, achieving work goals and spending time doing meaningful work that brings you joy. And so is your organisation. With fresh mindsets and solution-led approaches, they're going to see results, get commissions, retain a happy, motivated workforce that seemed impossible when they were only goal-focused. We all are going to need access and inclusion at some points in our lives, whether it's our own needs or those of a loved one. When injury or illness happens, 82% of disability happens during working age, at an already emotionally traumatic point, do we want people to stay in our own homes, surrounded by loved ones and possessions that support and sustain them, saving the NHS, local authority and Treasury valuable resources to spend elsewhere? Or will we accept watching our loved ones move to a care home 150 miles away because they had an available bed and it was affordable, reliant on cameras and apps, smartphone apps to deal with potential neglect? Will we really accept what academic Dominic Aitken calls the insurance risk theory, i.e., we hoped we wouldn't need accessibility, and if we did, we'll deal with it at a time? I want to finish by giving you a small and personal example of what accessibility can look like and who it can benefit. Picture my wife and a long-time friend of hers sitting on a sofa in our living room. They don't see each other very often, so it's a rare opportunity to catch up. It's a sunny day. The doors to the garden are open. I haven't mentioned that her friend's toddler is also there. She's just outside, enjoying some blissful autonomy. I live on a gently sloping plot We built our home. To get from the house to the garden, we need to go down a level. Conventionally, the obvious thing to have done would have been put in steps, but to meet my needs, we landscaped a zigzag ramp down. Kids love ramps. No wonder. There are no hard steps to faceplant. This child had freedom. No helicopter parent trying to frustrate exploration. The parent was relaxed, knowing her child was safe. And the friends had rare quality time together. No sign of a wheelchair user in this picture. And incidentally, as our dog got older, he also appreciated the lack of steps. Let me finish by saying, there is a power and value to inclusive design. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guy, for that really insightful and powerful presentation, and I'm sure there will be questions. We've got probably 5 to 10 minutes for questions, and just while people are thinking about what they might want to ask, I just wanted to confirm that unfortunately our next speaker, Steve Lakey from Clear Springs, has actually got COVID and is unable to make the presentation slot today. So we send him our very best wishes. We have got a backup plan, so we're going to ask Craig to fill that slot with a presentation. And the subject of that, Craig, you'll announce when you step up. That's great, brilliant. Okay, so thank you very much, Guy. And we've also got a swap over in terms of mic duties. So Sam, over to you to field the questions. Thank you.
I've had a promotion to intern. Don't all rush to put your hands up.
Thank you so much for your insightful talk. Do you feel there's a sweet spot where the needs of, we can create a sort of universal series of standards that would mean that there wouldn't necessarily be a separate accessible PRS? It would just, you feel that there would be some regulation come in to mean all accommodation would be? Is that a vision you think is possible?
Regulation for me, regulation is important, and also it's driven housing design, and actually there's some really capable, experienced, passionate people who've been part of that process and what we should see for regulation. But regulation, that's in terms of the building regs where wheelchair housing is actually implemented. The problem is we don't have a mandate to build accessible homes, and the government has slightly avoided the issue by making it optional, so that local authorities can choose to put in a minimum wheelchair accessible housing standard. The problem with this is that the local authorities have to jump through 2 bureaucratic hoops to do it, and they aren't resourced to be able to do that. So, for example, the GLA London has done it, and that's great, although seeing some of the stuff that's come through the pipeline is almost laughable, except that it's not funny, because they've just not quite understood the brief, or they've ghettoized wheelchair users, or they've stacked wheelchair users into a 15-story tower with no kind of reference to Grenfell. So there's a lot we need to do, but fundamentally I think that if we wait for government to make those changes, or wait for people to give us permission, we have a problem. And that actually, if as a mindset we start understanding what else accessibility gives us, what it does for communities, how it keeps people together, how it allows people to move around and work and raise families and everything else, then the rest slightly becomes less relevant because we're already doing it. So yeah, I want people to understand why they benefit, and usually they only understand it when they need it, by which point it's too late. Thank you. I think it's really important to say with questions, there's a real fear of being exposed for saying the wrong thing, or asking the wrong thing, or looking stupid, And I want us to keep our childlike curiosities. Like, I'm here, you can point and stare and you can ask questions, it's fine. But if you don't want to, that's fine too.
Hi there. I'm a town planner, and there have been a few planning appeal cases where the Equalities Act has come into play to kind of give that extra push for an appeal for a self-commissioned dwelling, wheelchair adapted. And I was just curious if you think that's, you've really talked about the carrot of good design, but we've got the Equalities Act, which is a bit of a stick, and I just wondered if you've run across that, either in councils, making policies or decisions, and what you think of that as a potential nudge.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. So when I set up my business, I had to look at what were my strengths and my experiences, and there are actually loads of really competent, like I say, really passionate people who understand the regulations, they understand the planning and all of that. For me, I see my remit as including more people into the conversation, just as a desire to do something to make change. So just as we have sustainability consultants who want to get their clients to understand why it's in their advantage, the whole cycle process. For me, it's like, look, if we already have a crisis, so it's going to be worse in 10 years. By 2036, we have 1 in 4 of us will be age 65 or over. And we talk about not having the right type of properties or family homes. Well, Savills did a very good report saying how there aren't the aspirational and accessible homes for older people to downsize to, so they're staying put. And, we don't have family homes, therefore, which could be family homes. I'm very much involved about the process of bringing people on board. So when I look at my 3 objectives, Agile's a very exciting partner for me because they're doing stuff at scale and they understand what access and inclusion looks like, so they put that out to everyone they're building homes for. When it comes to making the process easier, that's dealing with letting agents and the property portals. It's a whole different conversation. So I think your question is a really important one. It's more technical. It's actually away from my experience and my kind of business strategy. So I've just answered a different question. Sorry.
Guy, firstly, I'd say thank you so much for that talk. I found it moving, insightful, sort of profoundly important, and I sort of sensed that the hush around the room, that everybody kind of actually felt quite moved by that, and just how significant it is. Trying to pull a couple of strands together from the talks we've had this morning. I mean, we've worked on co-housing projects and also supported living schemes in various parts of Dorset, actually, and the southwest. And we're currently being sort of approached to look at whether or not co-housing and supported or assisted living could be a sort of a good combination. And I guess my question is a straight one. What do you think might be the benefits and shortfalls of that sort of approach? Because certainly one of our reflections as a practice on the supported living scheme we did was sort of piecing together people with a range of physical and learning disabilities in the same site. We sort of often wondered, well, who's going to move into them, and are they compatible? And in some cases, I guess yes, and others no. So yeah, just a few thoughts on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So co-housing is amazing, and given that co-housing is all about communities, I'm often amazed or surprised that they're not more accessible. And so if we look at, say, Marmalade Lane, won loads of awards. I was looking through it and going, but I can't see a single dwelling in there where there could be a wheelchair user. And I spoke with one of their people, I spoke with the developers, and it turns out that one of their leads, one of the people who lives there, her mum is a wheelchair user and she can't come and visit. So I kind of thought, well, that's really odd. Co-housing people get these ideas very quickly. They understand how it can nurture their community. I did But I think the thing with access and inclusion is we don't make the link, we don't see immediately why we need it. And that's one of my roles, is to say, that's why I asked those 4 questions at the beginning. It's like, these are people you know. I have 4 brothers and sisters. I can get into 2 of their homes. I can't stay in any of their homes. And I think I can only use the loo in one of their homes. And it doesn't have to be just us. Communities need diverse range of people and backgrounds and experience and opinions and ideas. And I think disability, old age, these are quite scary prospects when we're not included in the built environment. And it's really sad because actually, as I point out, when you include everyone in the built environment, you see these other benefits that we're just like, oh. But it takes someone who understands to point out, no, that's a benefit you're living right there, that's an experience, you're having this right now because of inclusion. And that's why I say when you see it, you can't unsee it. It's exciting. For me, it's really exciting.
Me again. Firstly, the boss that I had many years ago, decades ago in the 80s, who was in a wheelchair, taught me about the social theory of disability, and that it's not the physical impairment that creates the barriers, but it's us and our attitudes and our unconscious barriers. Just a useful education to have had. She got us to navigate the space we worked in from a wheelchair and to get ourselves on and off the toilet, which was great. Counterintuitively, I now live with a man who's got one leg, and he fell in love with a 3-story house, and our triumph is that he's just bought a recumbent to go exploring because he's so limited in his access to the world. Co-housing, Steve Gaskin comes to mind, and the farm, many, like getting from the 80s, they said that to support people with high support needs, the ratio is about 2 to about 50, 48. And it's a figure that kind of stays with me because I saw in the co-housing community I was part of in Australia, 3 people have had a really high quality end of life in Pinakari community, but it took a lot of support from the community. So there is a balance to be struck, and it is about intentional community. Now I have my question, which is, I have in the last year or 2 befriended a man who's blind, and I tried to get him into a co-housing space and realized that actually his map of the world is incredibly precise about where everything is. And for him to live in a space with others is much more complex than I'd realized. I also have another friend who is deaf, and I am aware of my impotence to include her in kind of the social things that are happening around me. And I just wondered if you know about any people who are working in that space of designing for people with, the other range of impairments.
Thank you. So there's lots of your last point, yes, there's a group of, a national group of access advisors and consultants, and they do a really good job. I have someone who works with me who does that, and she's kind of written the book on a load of this stuff and done it in residential and commercial and all sorts of different spaces. So we have the knowledge, and I look at sort of organisations like Arab who look like they're pretty out there with the kind of their inclusion team. I want to pick up on one thing you mentioned, which was about end of life and that sort of concerted and intentional effort from the community. And the way you're telling the story, I know it isn't this way, but it felt like I was hearing lots of people to help one person. And I think that there's a valuable thing in there that it's what everyone gets from it. It's not a one-way thing. And I had fun. So earlier this year, I was territorial army for my injury, and I missed the hills. And this year I had a bit of a breakthrough, and I thought, well, why don't I just go back to the hills? It's obvious. And I have a cross-country wheelchair, and that was pretty exciting. So one morning, I took myself off, arrived at Pennyfan in Wales, 8:30 in the morning. Everyone looked a bit surprised to see me with this chair, and was like, you know, you're going up there by yourself. It's like, I'm going to try. And I got some of the way up, that was about a third of the way up, and my arms were knackered then. Probably, perhaps that wasn't the best place to start first. But on the way down was actually more scary because it's quite an unstable machine. But long story short, at the bottom, there were a couple of people. I said, you know, could you just give me a hand over this obstacle? And they're like, yeah. So they helped me over a couple, and I said, that's great, thanks. You know, you can carry on, it'll slow you down. And they're like, no, we're going to the bottom. We'll take you all the way. And so we had a really good laugh, ice cream at the bottom, and then they said, do you want to come swimming in the reservoir? I was like, well, yeah, if you can stick me on your back and get me in, sure. And the point is, you know, I had this thing on the way down of not wanting to ask because I didn't want to burden people. Actually, they were having a really enjoyable time. For them, it was something else. So I think it's just we all bring something to the party, and let's enjoy that. Let's be proud of it. Thank you.